There's a number that just quietly appeared in a government report, and it's going to change how much money flows into Buckingham Palace for the next 5 years. It's not a rumor. It's not a leak. It's an official document published by the Royal Trustees themselves, and it confirms that royal funding is about to swing from its highest level in over a decade to a sharp reset downward. Along the way, it also settles a question people have wondered about for years. Why doesn't Queen Camilla have her own separate income, the way Prince Philip did for nearly 70 years? If you follow the royal family, you've probably heard plenty of dramatic claims about palace finances. Allowances being cut, queens being punished, princes seizing control. Today we're setting the drama aside and looking at what's actually happening, according to the real financial reports, the National Audit Office, and Parliament's own briefings. It's a story about money, yes, but it's really a story about how an 800-year-old institution is trying to modernize itself in full public view. And by the end, you'll understand exactly why the grant is about to fall by nearly 30%, and what that means for the people living inside the palace walls. If you enjoy royal history, financial deep dives, and stories that go beyond the headlines, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss what's coming next. To understand what's changing, you first need to understand the system itself, because it's stranger and more transparent than most people realize. For centuries, the monarch's expenses were covered through something called the civil list, a fixed annual payment from Parliament in exchange for the Crown handing over the profits from its land holdings. That arrangement ended in 2012, replaced by what's called the sovereign grant. Under this system, the government gives the royal household a percentage of the profits generated by the Crown estate, a vast portfolio of land and property, including a huge chunk of the British seabed, technically owned by the monarchy but managed independently on the public's behalf. Crucially, the money doesn't come from taxpayers directly out of general revenue. It comes from the Crown's own commercial assets, funneled back through Parliament. That single design choice explains almost everything that's happened to royal funding over the past few years, because when Crown estate profits go up, the sovereign grant goes up with them, and right now those profits have been going up dramatically for one specific reason: offshore wind. The Crown estate owns the seabed around England, Wales, and Northern Ireland, which means every offshore wind farm built in those waters pays licensing fees to the Crown estate. As Britain has raced to expand renewable energy, those fees have exploded, generating hundreds of millions of pounds that never existed in previous decades. In 2023, the Royal Trustees, a small group made up of the Prime Minister, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and the Keeper of the Privy Purse, recognized that this windfall would push the sovereign grant to an oddly large number if the usual formula stayed in place. So they made an adjustment. Instead of the Crown receiving 25% of Crown estate profits, as it had for years, they cut that share down to 12%. It was, in effect, a deliberate move to stop the monarchy's public funding from ballooning purely because of a wind energy boom that had nothing to do with royal duties. Even with that reduced percentage, the numbers have still been climbing because there's a second factor layered on top: Buckingham Palace itself. Back in 2017, the sovereign grant received a temporary top-up specifically to fund a 10-year, roughly £369 million restoration project, replacing electrical wiring, plumbing, and heating systems throughout the palace that, in some cases, hadn't been touched since the 1950s. That project, known as the resurfacing program, is now in its final stretch, with palace areas being reoccupied in phases through 2027 and 2028. Because that extra funding was always meant to be temporary, official reports confirm the sovereign grant reached its peak at £137.9 million for the 2026 to 27 financial year, the highest total in the grant's history. But peaks, by definition, don't last. The Royal Trustees completed a scheduled 5-year review in June 2026, examining what the household will actually need once the restoration work wraps up. Their conclusion was unambiguous. From 2027 to 28 onward, the sovereign grant will be reset to £99.9 million a year, with the underlying percentage of Crown estate profits set at 20.5% for the following 5 years. That's a drop of roughly £38 million, or close to 30%, from the current peak. Because the law technically doesn't allow the grant to shrink year over year under the existing formula, Parliament actually has to pass new legislation, a sovereign grant bill, just to make the decrease possible. Officials have also built in a new mechanism specifically designed to prevent what the trustees called inappropriately high funding in the future, a safeguard against the grant ballooning again if Crown Estate profits keep climbing. Put simply, this isn't a punishment, a scandal, or a political fight. It's closer to a household finally being able to shrink its budget once a major renovation is paid off, except the household happens to be the British monarchy, and the renovation happens to be one of the most famous buildings on Earth. Now here's where the popular narrative and the real documentation start to diverge, because you'll often see headlines suggesting Camilla has some kind of independent royal fortune that's now being clawed back. The reality, according to the National Audit Office and Parliament's own research briefings, is almost the opposite. Camilla has never had a personal annuity at all. That distinction matters historically. Prince Philip, as consort to Queen Elizabeth II, received a separate parliamentary annuity worth £359,000 a year, an arrangement dating back to 1952 that continued even after he stepped back from public duties in 2017, right up until his death in 2021. When the funding system was overhauled in 2012, lawmakers made a specific choice not to extend a similar personal annuity to Camilla. Instead, her official activities, her patronages, her engagements, her staff support, are funded directly out of the general sovereign grant pool, the same pot that covers Charles's own duties and the rest of the working household. There was no separate account for her to begin with, and so there's no separate account being reduced now. Any change to her office's resources rises and falls with the same institutional formula affecting everyone else under that roof. That's a meaningfully different story than an allowance being cut in anger. It's a structural fact that's been true since Charles became king, quietly documented in NAO reports and largely overlooked by the public until financial reviews like this one bring it back into focus. It's also worth being clear about what the sovereign grant funds in the first place, because the phrase royal funding tends to conjure images of personal spending, designer wardrobes, private holidays, lavish parties. In reality, the vast majority of it goes toward things that look much more like running any large public institution. The grant covers the cost of official duties carried out on behalf of the Crown, staff salaries across the household, property maintenance for occupied royal palaces, travel connected to state business, and the substantial security and logistics required every time a member of the family appears in public. According to the most recent sovereign grant report, the royal family was involved in nearly 1,900 public engagements across a recent reporting year, with tens of thousands of guests hosted at official royal palaces. None of that comes free, and none of it is optional if the institution is going to keep functioning as a working part of British public life. Personal wealth is a completely separate category, governed by different rules entirely. King Charles's private income comes through the Duchy of Lancaster, a landed estate that has funded the monarch's personal and family expenses for centuries, while the Prince of Wales, currently William, receives income from the Duchy of Cornwall, a similar estate tied specifically to the heir apparent. Both duchies are independently audited, but neither is part of the sovereign grant, and neither is what's being adjusted in this latest review. There's also private income from investments and inheritance that isn't disclosed publicly at all, which critics have long argued makes full transparency about royal wealth practically impossible, even with reports like this one. It's worth pausing on why any of this becomes public at all. The Sovereign Grant Act specifically requires the Royal Trustees to review the funding formula at regular intervals, and it requires the household to publish detailed annual accounts, examined by the National Audit Office, the same independent watchdog that audits government departments. That's a relatively recent development in the monarchy's long history. For most of its existence, royal finances were essentially opaque, tucked inside a civil list negotiated privately with Parliament. The current King's Keeper of the Privy Purse has publicly stressed that the growing grant should never be read as a blank check, describing spending as governed by the same standards and disciplines as any publicly funded body, including independent audits and Treasury oversight. That framing matters because it positions this latest reset not as an embarrassment being forced on the palace, but as evidence the system is working the way it's supposed to. Funding rises temporarily to pay for a genuinely necessary infrastructure project, then falls back down once that project is finished. Buckingham Palace has also begun publishing figures on the King's own tax contributions, confirming more than £30 million paid voluntarily since his accession, including nearly £12 million in a single recent tax year. None of the monarch's income is legally required to be taxed, since no UK law obligates the King or the Prince of Wales to pay tax on their private revenue. But voluntary payments and public disclosure have become part of how the institution tries to maintain public confidence, especially at a moment when household budgets across Britain are under their own kind of pressure. So what should you actually expect to see over the coming months? Watch for the Sovereign Grant Bill making its way through Parliament, since new legislation is required before the funding decrease can legally take effect. Watch for the phased reoccupation of restored sections of Buckingham Palace through 2027 and into 2028, which will effectively mark the finish line for the resurfacing program that's driven a decade of elevated funding. And watch for the next scheduled review of the Crown Estate percentage, since the trustees have already signaled that 20.5% is meant to hold only through 2031 to 32, at which point the whole formula gets reassessed again. None of this is likely to generate a single dramatic headline the way palace conflict stories do. It's slower, more procedural, and honestly more revealing about how the modern monarchy actually operates. Not through private feuds settled behind closed doors, but through legislation, audited reports, and formulas tied to offshore wind revenue. A genuinely strange sentence to say out loud about an institution that traces back nearly 1,000 years. What this really shows is an institution trying to balance two things that don't always sit comfortably together. The need to fund a working head of state with proper security, staff, and public engagements, and the need to be seen doing that responsibly at a time when every pound of public money faces more scrutiny than ever before. The rise to £137.9 million wasn't secrecy, it was a published, explained response to a specific infrastructure project. And the fall to £99.9 million isn't punishment. It's that same project reaching its end. If you found this breakdown useful, let me know in the comments what you'd like to see covered next. Whether that's a closer look at the Crown Estate's offshore wind windfall, how the Duchy of Cornwall actually works, or how other European monarchies fund themselves by comparison. And if you enjoy stories that dig past the headlines and into how these institutions really function, go ahead and hit subscribe, because there's a lot more of this coming. Thanks for watching. This script is based on publicly available financial reports from the Royal Household, the National Audit Office, Treasury, and the House of Commons Library, current as of July 2026. **